Hey, it's Jordan with TYT Politics. I'm here in East Chicago, Indiana. Not Chicago, East Chicago, Indiana. There was a complex, a low-income complex, mostly African Americans, about 3 or 4 decades old, that was literally built where a lead smelting plant used to be. Lead coming up out of the soil about 212 times the allowable limit. The allowable limit is an arbitrary number the EPA gives of 15 parts per billion. So you're talking 212 times the allowable limit. In August, the EPA told me on camera there's no issue with the water. Fast forward 3 months later, well, what do you know? They find lead in the water. That's when I came back. I did my own testing. In 2 homes, we found lead, we found copper, we found iron, we found chloroform. You know, in scary movies, the shit the bad guy puts over your face with the napkin to make you pass out. Chloroform and other things. And now I'm back because East Chicago was just declared a disaster emergency, something that Flint, unfortunately, was never able to get. When disaster is declared, that kicks in extra funding and things like that. So I'm back here. I'm here with Thomas Franks, and I'm not going to tell you where we are. He'll tell you where we are, but it's one of the epicenters of what I would say the toxic waste dump that is being allowed in America. Where are we, Thomas?
Well, we're sitting in Marktown, in the Marktown Park, right across the street from BP, which is in East Chicago. BP is the largest tar sands refinery in the Midwest, or actually in the country. It's where a lot of the pipeline infrastructure, Enbridge, comes and converges here to be refined into a product, whether it's kerosene, jet fuel, or gasoline. So that comes right here. The reason we're here and why it's connected to this is BP is one of the responsible parties for the lead contamination. They bought into the liability of the lead foundries there. So they are one of the prior responsible parties.
So what does that mean, they bought into the liability of the lead?
Well, one of the entities that were in existence down there was ARCO. And so they purchased ARCO, and that ended up putting them in as one of the responsible parties. They bought their liability. ARCO doesn't exist anymore, but BP does now.
And obviously BP, if you've been living under a rock, BP spill, Deepwater Horizon in 2010, they cleaned that up. You've seen all the puffy PR commercials. You go talk to the people down there about how good that cleanup was.
So what's really important for us and where we're at, we have never met with the responsible parties. As citizens of East Chicago and trying to get justice, they have been kind of hiding behind the broker, and that being EPA. For instance, in Zone 3.
I just want to backtrack.
Yeah.
There are 3 zones,
Yes.
Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. Can you explain the Zone 1, how this was first brought up to the national spotlight? Tell us the history about this area, why it's so contaminated with lead.
Well, first of all, East Chicago for the last 100 years throughout the 20th century identified itself as the most industrial city in the world, and it really probably was. We have some of the most toxic waters in the country, we have the toxic lands, and our air shed is one of the most toxic.
Indiana has some of the most lax environmental regulations in the country.
Completely. It's almost like the Wild West when it comes to environmental stewardship. Our waterways are the most polluted in terms of toxic industrial wastes into its water. We discharge more toxic waste into our waterways than any other state in the union. In fact, we discharge 30% more than the second worst offender. You can take the last 25 states and combine them, which represent a population of 100 million people, and Indiana still discharges more, and we only represent 6.7 million people. That's how relaxed our environmental regime is here. And that's why all this heavy, big industry is concentrated here. Relative to Chicago, we're kind of an industrial colony of Chicago. Chicago deindustrialized about 40 years ago, and they pushed that industry here, where the environmental regime was more favorable to them. So now Chicago's more of an information economy, but we're still on an old industrial economy, and that economy hasn't bode well for our region for the last 40 years. With the U.S. Superfund site, we have Zone 1, which is where the housing complex was, and that was built right on top of one of the lead refineries.
So this was the low-income, mostly black housing complex, West Calumet Complex, where they found lead in the soil 212 times the allowable limit.
Right, and then there's Zone 2 and Zone 3, and both Zone 2 and Zone 3 are owner-occupied. As you go to Zone 3, it's much more towards middle income, but we've lost property values enormously, about 50% in the last 7-8 years.
The main difference is Zone 1 is kind of a low-income apartment complexes. Zone 2, 3, houses, homeowners.
Right, and Zone 2 has become pretty blighted because it's been lacking investment. But one of the things that we've been facing with the Superfund site is having a dialogue with the responsible parties. The only dialogue that's occurring between, with the responsible party is between the EPA and BP or DuPont or ARCO. We don't have that connection. So several years ago, in 2014, EPA settled with they had a consent decree with the responsible parties where they got $26 million to clean up only Zone 1 and Zone 3. They didn't have any monies for Zone 2. We weren't a part of that dialogue. So right now we have a legal action, a motion to intervene to try to open that up, to begin to have a dialogue. We've also been inviting these responsible parties to the table so we can talk to them about how to make these people whole and what to do on their behalf. So that's one of the reasons why we're here in front of BP, is because when you have heavy industry like this, and you've had it for a long time, and they've been able to do what they want, and they haven't had much regulation regulating them, there are all these cascading effects, social, economic, and environmental effects that go under addressed. And so that's one of the things that we're seeing here. We're facing so many disruptions to the residents that live here because of this Superfund, not only just its designation, but trying to address the problems. I mean, we have kids, and we had to close a school that was just recently built, and that's cost the city a lot of money. We've had to address their health concerns, their learning disabilities. We've had to address, we had to bus them. We've had to evacuate 1,200 people, in a mass evacuation. That's still in process.
So I want to move backwards because I want to make sure the audience knows the history. And by the way, guys, I'm going to take your questions, so start sending them in. So the EPA and the city knew that this whole community was built next to lead plants and lead emitters dating back to the 1970s and 80s, correct?
The EPA knew that Calumet was next to and on top of lead facilities since the day EPA was formed.
In the early 1970s.
Yes, so it has always been known. So that's been a problem.
And when they did testing over the last few decades, it was only in what they deemed like hot zones. They didn't do the whole comprehensive complex until last year.
Right. So, well, let's back up. In 1990, it was proposed to designate that area as a Superfund site.
A Superfund site is a site that's basically near a lot of toxic chemicals and things like that.
Yeah, Superfund site means that a company has caused some problems. It needs some emergency cleanup. So in 1990, it was proposed to be placed on the list. Why it wasn't placed on the list, we don't know. We do know prior to then, right across the street from the neighborhood, we had some lead tests as much as 500,000 parts per million. That's every other particle was a lead particle in the soil. It's why, and the kids were testing very high in lead in that area. So it took another 18, 19 years before it finally got on the list as a Superfund site, on their national priority list. The problem about that is, had they designated them in 1990 on the list, the Superfund program was well financed. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until 1995 that they didn't reauthorize the program under Bill Clinton, and then it wasn't until 2003 that the Superfund program went bankrupt. So now we're in a system that's managed by a bankrupt system, the Superfund program, and we have to go back to the responsible parties. Some of them have been bankrupt themselves, and we have to sue them to be able to get cleanup monies to clean this up. And
it's not like BP's jumping at the chance to provide any money.
No. The BP, they jump at a chance when money's given to them. Like, for instance, they moved this here just 3 years ago into East Chicago, and man, you know how Trump said, we're going to build that wall, we're going to make Mexico pay for it? Well, BP built that here, and East Chicago paid for it. One of the poorest cities in the country, in the city, and at least in this state, gave BP $165 million to build that in East Chicago.
Why?
It's a real question. Not only that, but it's right across the street. If you scan around, right across the street from a National Historic District called Marktown. It's a workers' village. And it's funny, it's Garden City concept. And they're in the process of tearing down Marktown. So they moved this facility right across the street from a National Historic District, and they are now tearing it down. So those are some of the problems. It's a bankrupt system, and we're having to go back to them and ask them and ask them and ask them again. But the problem that we have is we have the EPA brokering that relationship. We have yet to meet with BP. We have yet to meet with DuPont. We have yet to meet with any representative ARCO. And that
we should say DuPont, the insecticides plant, is also in East Chicago, so they are one of the responsible parties as well.
Yeah, exactly. So that facility had been in operation, whether it was before that, it was called Griselli, since 1889. So they have been doing lots of different things. Right now it's Grace Davidson, and they are doing a lot of emulsions for photography, for x-ray devices and stuff like that. And so we do know, because of the characterization, that there are a lot of contaminants in the soil on their property. In fact, the EPA put in a temporary slurry wall to kind of create a barrier in the ground for the groundwater, so it doesn't float out of it, but it's not a closed system. So, and it because it was temporary, it's also not very well developed. And if you went to Maritza's, or you're going to be going to Sarah's home or some of the other residents, that's only within a block from their home. We're going after some, like BP, we have ArcelorMittal, who has the largest blast furnace in the Western Hemisphere right here. These are some of the most profitable industries in human history. And they've been able to walk away from their liabilities here. And we have to argue for every little cost, every little thing. When a rich person when somebody's rich and privileged sues, they can get millions for the kinds of things that have been done to them personally. We're getting these residents, which are very vulnerable to the system. They're underprivileged. They don't have much of a voice. They're being threatened on so many levels. They can't fight on all these levels. There's $26 million to clean up a huge 327-acre site. And their homes are already suffering. I'll give you an example. East Chicago, the median home value in America is over $217,000. East Chicago median home value is $55,000. We're already 1/4 of the market.
And it's getting worse now.
And it's getting much worse. A community like Marktown or West Calumet or Calumet, the median home value in Marktown is only $25,000. And other neighborhoods are like $25,000. What we're seeing in Calumet is we've seen a tremendous drop, about a 50% drop in home values since it was designated as a Superfund site. It's obvious to me, probably to most people, why that would be. But these are some of the things that wealth has been taken away from these communities, mostly communities of color, and they haven't been able to acquire wealth.
But also, I want to get to the health point, and that's why this story is so important. So if you live in the Midwest or industrial areas of the country with all these plants, listen up. So the bottom line is, I spoke, for example, with a former NFL player here. He was a receiver. He's now in his 60s. When he was growing up here, he's an African American. All the kids were playing out in these complexes right next to a lead plant. And the EPA didn't even exist back then. It's not just that particular zone. When you have lead plants, it spreads through the air. You also have lead emitters. You also had an insecticide plant. So essentially, this whole community was in a dust bowl of lead. So now what we're seeing over the last 8 to 9 months, all the people, I've spoken with people here the last time I was here, they say, oh, I would talk to all my neighbors and we'd all be wondering, oh, what a coincidence. We all have asthma. We all have bronchitis that won't go away. So, oh, wow, it's so strange. Like 3 or 4 young women on this block are getting cancer in their 30s. I interviewed a woman who was never sick in her life, moved into the complex where they found the original lead that was 212 times the allowable limit. She had to get a hysterectomy at age 29. And now she's got all types of illnesses. So people are now all of a sudden connecting the dots to their upper respiratory illnesses. There has been crime in the area. We know that high levels of lead are linked to high crime areas because lead affects your mood, it affects your IQ, your behavior, everything. It's very toxic, particularly to children. So we're talking about liability, but who's going to pay for these people's testing? Who's going to pay for their treatments? Who's going to pay retroactively? I've talked to people who have paid out of pocket thousands and thousands of dollars for their health treatments. So it's a little different than Flint, because Flint was a specific decision made in 2014 to switch from the Detroit water system to the Flint water system. This wasn't a specific decision. This has been decades in the making. So now people don't know if their illnesses were caused by this. And the EPA, to my knowledge, has only tested about 30 to 40 homes here. They haven't tested more homes. We are going to be testing more homes this weekend. If the EPA is not going to do it, we'll do it. I have an investigator coming here. He's done testing in Flint. So I wanted to ask you, before we get to audience questions, one more question. So it was just declared a disaster. Now there's headlines and people would say, oh, great, they're taking action. But from what you tell me, the disaster, which, by the way, our current Vice President, Mike Pence, who didn't bother to come down here while he was Vice President, a low-income Black and Latino community, Pence couldn't be bothered. He did leave the campaign trail for a photo op in a white neighborhood that was hit with a tornado. So he'll go to a white neighborhood. He won't come to a Black and Latino neighborhood. He would not declare this a disaster area. The new governor, Eric Holcomb, has. What do you get? What is East Chicago getting with this disaster declaration?
Well, what we're getting is not what we asked for, but it is something. We got a 30-day window, and that's what it's for. He's promised $2 million to the mayor to demolish the facility, and he's also promised. There's a lot of vague language to help the remaining residents move out. But other than that, this is, again, 3 zones. It isn't addressing any of the human concerns. The reason why we were asking the mayor to make the request of the governor and the governor to declare this a Superfund or a emergency declaration is to begin to address the concerns of the residents and their needs, not the materials, not the city's needs, but the residents' needs. And unfortunately, that hasn't been done. When it comes to the health, what we're asking for is health care for life for these residents. And it's not just the present population that happens to be there, but the populations that have been there. It's a huge population. So many people have been affected in many, many ways. We're also asking for the homeowners now. We've been addressing for a long time the low-income housing complex, but we're also now asking for the homeowners a program to give them some tax abatement, how to address their property value issues, maybe a voluntary buyout for them as well, to be able to move to a comparable homes in a safe community. What we're also would love to have had, and it wasn't included in the emergency declaration, was any water filters. We would love to have that be used to supply water filters. What we learned from the Superfund site in testing a few of those properties is that East Chicago, and this is what the EPA Region 5 has said, Miguel Del Toro had stated, is that 90% of East Chicago is probably drinking contaminated water.
I want to cut you off for a second.
Yeah.
I just want to let this sink in. He just said, an EPA official said 90% of East Chicago is probably drinking contaminated water. Okay? He said that in February? Recently.
Just a
recently.
couple of weeks ago.
All right. In August, when we were here, the EPA official said to me, this is not like Flint. It's not a water issue. Now, this isn't to shit on the EPA, but the point is, as we saw in Flint, where for over a year, they were saying there's no problem with the water. When you hear from the EPA, the city, no problem, it's not the water, this and that, I'm not saying they're intentionally lying, but you cannot immediately just take it on faith that there's no problem with your water. This isn't for me to fearmonger, but this could be your community next. Google it. Every other day, there's another problem in another city, in another town with water contamination, whether it's lead, whether it's arsenic, whether it's a lot of different stuff. So when the EPA says, oh, it's not an issue, well, how thorough is the EPA testing? If you've seen my other videos, not thorough enough. So I just wanted to point that out. Less than 6 months ago, the EPA said there was not a water issue here. Now an EPA official is saying probably 90% of the homes are contaminated.
Yeah, and let me clarify that. What he is saying is that about 90% of the homes are leaded pipes. and also why
Possible contamination.
with possible contamination. And what they've discovered is the East Chicago is probably utilizing not enough anti-corrosives. What's important to your audience and to everybody is that the drinking water contamination is not something related to the Superfund site. We discovered it in that process in making demands on the EPA to test the water because we wanted to address all the leaded pathways, the pathways that lead might affect the residents there, so that they would have accumulative effects. But what we found is it's affecting all of East Chicago, and it's probably affecting all older water infrastructure in the United States. This is something that many communities are going to be needing to face. We just happen to be following on the heels of Flint. Ours happens to be an issue of our water infrastructure, and we need to replace that. But in the interim, we need to get filters for the residents.
What that means, by the way, most of these cities are on top of lead pipes that are 60, 70, 80 years old. The same lead pipes that Republicans, I'll give Obama credit, Obama had a Jobs Act he proposed in 2011. In that was a lot of money for infrastructure. They wouldn't allow it. Trump's talking about infrastructure now. We'll see how much actually goes to changing pipes, because there's lead pipes that are old all over the country.
That's exactly true, and that's what we're facing here. For a community like ours, we're vulnerable to so many impacts, and that just compounds it.